Have you ever walked away from a conversation and wondered, why did I stay silent? You smiled even though you felt hurt inside. You nodded even when every cell in your body wanted to say no. Not because you didn't know what was right, but because you feared being judged, feared making others uncomfortable, feared being labeled as difficult. And so, you compromised not to live in harmony with others, but just to be accepted. What's most frightening isn't being rejected, it's when you abandon yourself. Many live under the mask of being kind and easygoing, while deep down, they are exhausted from always needing permission to be who they truly are. Stoicism doesn't teach us to harden ourselves to appear strong, but to learn how to stand firm without needing others' approval. When you begin to live consciously, to truly listen to yourself, and refuse to live by someone else's script, you'll realize that peace isn't found in being liked, it's found in being respected, first and foremost, by yourself. And that is the path we will walk together today. Lesson 1. Don't trade your values for approval. There's a paradox most people experience. The more we crave validation, the easier it becomes to lose ourselves. In the smallest moments when we change our opinion just because the majority disagrees, when we praise something we don't truly believe in, when we stay silent in the face of injustice out of fear of criticism, that's when our core values are traded for a fleeting sense of safety. But that safety is fragile, and in the end, it leaves nothing but a fracture in our self-respect. Stoicism teaches that dignity is never determined from the outside. It is preserved, protected, and cultivated from within through quiet and consistent choices. When you live for someone else's approval, you stop being the master of your life. Every compliment or critique becomes a steering wheel for your emotions, and you drift like a ship with no anchor. In Stoic thought, this isn't just unwise, it's dangerous. Because a person like that can be easily controlled by a disapproving glance or a sarcastic remark. When your worth depends on being accepted, you've handed that power over to others, and no one can live fully while being defined by someone else. External recognition, if it comes, should be treated as a gift, not a need. If you receive it, accept it with calm gratitude. If not, you should still stand firm without collapsing. Someone who lives by internal standards doesn't need the crowd to validate their path, nor applause to feel right. For them, the only question that matters is, does this align with my values? And if the answer is yes, then whether the world agrees or not becomes irrelevant. The craving for recognition is planted in us early. As children, we learn that pleasing adults earns praise, while disagreement brings scolding. As we grow, this becomes a mental habit. We measure our worth by how others react. Then one day we find ourselves living not by what we believe, but by what we think will gain approval. Stoicism invites us to break that habit not through rebellion, but through awareness. It doesn't ask us to be indifferent to everything, but warns us not to let our mind become public property. At the heart of this lesson is the distinction between inner worth and outer validation. Inner worth doesn't shift just because someone disagrees, mocks, or ignores you. It's like a mountain, whether shrouded in clouds or bathed in sunlight, it remains still and unchanging. Meanwhile, public praise is like the wind. It comes and goes, sometimes warm, sometimes harsh, but never solid enough to build a life upon. In Enchiridion, Epictetus writes that what distresses people is not events themselves, but how they judge them. Similarly, a criticism won't hurt you unless you agree with it, unless you allow it to define how you see yourself. When you live always facing outward, you let the shifting winds of public opinion steer your inner vessel. But when you turn inward, building your compass on reason, virtue, and self-command, you stop being so easily swayed. A Stoic doesn't need to rebel to prove themselves. They don't react harshly to judgment. They simply don't let praise or blame bend their principles. That isn't stubbornness, it's discipline, trained through reflection and inner rigor. They understand that living to be liked is a form of mental slavery. And they choose instead to live as a free person, someone whose stillness comes from knowing who they are, without needing anyone to confirm it. In a world where everyone performs on an invisible stage, from social media to daily life, choosing to live by your own values becomes an act of courage. Not because it creates conflict, but because it requires you to stand alone when needed. Yet that solitude is the clearest sign of dignity. For the one who no longer fears being left behind is the one who has learned to stand on their own feet, unaided. So the next time you feel tempted to do something just to impress, pause and ask, if no one ever knew, would I still do this? If the answer is no, then it's not an act born from your true self. It's a performance. And you weren't born to perform for the world. You were born to live clearly, truthfully, without wavering. To become whole, not for applause, but because you know you are worthy. We don't need to be the most outstanding person in the room. We only need to be the one who doesn't retreat from themselves. And when you live this way, the respect you once chased will come to find you, not because you sought it, but because you became someone worthy of receiving it. Lesson 2. You don't need to be loud to have presence. In a world growing louder by the day, where everyone tries to stand out, silence becomes a radical act. Many believe presence means being seen, being noticed, being acknowledged in every space they enter. They adjust their tone, posture, clothing, even their thinking just to ensure their existence doesn't go unnoticed. But true presence, the kind that leaves a deep and lasting impression, doesn't come from drawing attention. It comes from inner energy, from steady quiet, from the clarity a person carries within. Stoicism holds that anything which depends on an audience to exist is already unstable. A person who only feels valuable when seen will panic when no one's watching. But someone who knows who they are, what's right, and why they're here doesn't need spotlights or applause to feel whole. They don't live as if performing. They live knowing every action, even the quietest, matters because it flows from an unshakable center. True presence can't be manufactured through tricks. It doesn't come from speaking loudly, walking boldly, or showing expertise. It comes from silent integrity, from alignment between words, actions, and values. Such a person doesn't chase attention. They naturally draw it precisely because they don't need it. Like a rock in a river, still, soundless, and yet all eyes are drawn to its solidity. When you no longer need to be noticed, you begin to taste inner freedom. You stop measuring yourself by how many people see you, by likes, praise, or gazes. You start to care about the quality of your presence, whether you live true to your values, maintain your composure in chaos, and remain yourself in each moment. The paradox is this: when you stop seeking the gaze starts to find you. But this time, it's not fleeting curiosity. It's genuine respect for someone who refuses to be swept up in the crowd. To the Stoic, attention is not a reward, it's a test. It easily makes one forget who they are, tempts them to perform rather than live. And it's a hard trap to escape because it offers short-term gratification while slowly eroding long-term dignity. Stoic philosophers didn't live to stand out, they lived to be right. They understood that stage lights may dazzle, but only the inner quiet keeps you from drifting away. What we call presence, if built on the expectation of reaction, will always be unstable. You'll be pulled this way or that, swayed by trends, opinions, and emotions of others. But if your presence comes from self-knowledge, from clarity with yourself, then you can walk into any space without needing to change to fit in. You won't need to speak much, prove anything, or always be seen. Because real presence is a kind of unspoken influence. It doesn't demand attention, but when people notice, they feel its depth. You don't need to be loud to be heard, nor flashy to be remembered. In a room full of voices, the one who listens stands out. In a society shouting to assert itself, the one who guards inner silence commands the space without seizing it. Stoicism teaches you don't need to flare like fireworks to be seen. Be the steady flame warm enough to be sought, enduring enough to outlast. Sustainable presence comes not from emphasis, but from consistency. The person with presence is not always right, but always clear. They are not masters of attraction, but immune to distraction. When you learn to stand in a room without needing attention, you move closer to inner freedom, where your value is no longer tied to others' eyes. You don't need to sketch your identity through the gaze of others. You only need to build your foundation so strong that even if no one's watching, you still know who you are, what you're doing, and why it matters. That is independent presence. That is silence with weight. That is what makes an ordinary person unforgettable, not because they're loud, but because they're real. Remember, all showmanship fades quickly, but the quiet things, if true, echo long after. When you stop trying to impress, you become impressive without effort. Not because you're seen, but because you don't need to be seen to exist. And in today's world, that's not just a philosophy, it's a form of power. Lesson 3. Self-discipline is the foundation of dignity. Dignity is not something to be demanded from others, nor is it a reward granted when we achieve something great. Dignity is built little by little in how we treat ourselves, especially when no one is watching. And the foundation of that dignity is self-discipline, the ability to control oneself in moments when emotion, desire, or laziness could easily overpower reason. Stoicism never defines freedom as the right to do whatever we want. It defines freedom as the right not to do what goes against our conscience and values. Self-discipline is not harsh self-denial or ascetic control. It is the highest form of freedom. Freedom from short-term temptations, from impulsive reactions, from easy compromises that we'll later regret. A person who cannot govern themselves will always be governed by the outside world. They are easily swayed by enticing but hollow invitations, quick to fall into fleeting emotions, ready to trade what matters for what feels urgent. But the disciplined person lives like a quiet gatekeeper of their mind, allowing in only what is right and rejecting what harms, even if it comes disguised as comfort. In Stoic thought, what makes a person noble is not status or talent, but the ability to uphold moral principles amid conditions that tempt surrender. That doesn't come from force or pretense, but from consistent training to say no at the right time, training not to respond to insult with insult, training not to let fleeting feelings direct lasting actions. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, "Get up and do what needs to be done, as one born to live by reason." A simple but profound reminder, for only when you act from principle, not impulse, do you live as a human being rather than merely react as an instinct. Self-discipline is neither gifted with age nor innate by birth. It is the outcome of small, repeated choices, especially in moments when no one expects you to choose at all. When you choose the harder path because it's the right one, you're building an internal moral system. When you choose silence over conflict, books over endless scrolling, keeping a promise to yourself over procrastination, you're fortifying the foundation of your dignity. And when that foundation becomes solid, you no longer need admiration to feel secure because you've become someone you yourself respect. Inner discipline is also the way you show respect for your own life. When you indulge recklessly, you don't just harm yourself, you signal to the world that you don't see yourself as worthy of serious investment. On the other hand, each time you patiently do the right thing without being asked, you tell the world, "I matter enough to live by what I believe." Over time, this leads others to take you seriously, to respect your boundaries, to no longer treat your presence as a given. Around you, some live by craving, others by gratification, and many by pressure. But the disciplined live by direction. They are not swept along by events, not shaken by others' changes, not drawn into the endless race to outdo. They know what they want, why they do it, and are willing to accept slowness, solitude, or misunderstanding to stay on course. Discipline frees them from chasing image because they've built substance. Discipline frees them from needing to win every argument because they've already won the inner battle in silence. One thing must be noted. Disciplined people are not cold or emotionless. They feel deeply, perhaps even more than most, but they don't let emotions take the wheel. They treat emotions like weather observing, understanding, accepting, but not letting them dictate direction. They know a few minutes of anger can cause years of damage. They know today's delay can cost tomorrow's chance. And they choose short-term difficulty to preserve long-term freedom. That is discipline. That is practical wisdom. Lesson 4. Boundaries don't need to be announced, only practiced. Not everyone intends to hurt you, but many will cross the line unintentionally simply because you haven't drawn it. The world can't read your mind. If you don't clarify what is acceptable and what is not, others' assumptions will slowly replace your principles. In reality, most disrespect doesn't show up in dramatic acts. It seeps in through jokes that go too far. Unreasonable requests quietly agreed to, sacrifices made without any resistance. Stoicism teaches that you don't need to be loud, angry, or dramatic to protect your boundaries. You just need to live clearly, act decisively, and remain consistent with your values. True boundaries aren't declared in words, but in consistent behavior. Every time you let something pass that violates what you believe in without speaking up, you blur the line between respect and permission, and gradually, self-respect is eroded not by others' actions, but by your silent complicity. Keeping boundaries doesn't mean being closed off, cold, or distant. It simply means being intentional about how you allow others to engage with you. Not everyone deserves your trust, and not every relationship is worth trading your inner peace. If you don't set boundaries, others will set the terms of how they treat you, and few people behave well towards someone who doesn't know how to protect themselves. Practicing boundaries is a lesson in self-mastery. You don't need to shout to express discontent. You don't need to explain endlessly every time you say no. You only need to live your boundaries calmly but firmly, and the world will slowly adjust. And if someone cannot respect your limits, their departure is not a loss, but a natural cleansing. Stoicism doesn't encourage confrontation or defiance. It encourages right action, even if it displeases others. If someone thinks you're difficult because you don't blindly agree, that's a consequence, not a flaw. For adults, don't measure kindness by softness, but by the ability to stand firm under pressure without losing principle. And the more silent you are when your boundaries are crossed, the more you reinforce a dangerous truth: that others' comfort matters more than your self-respect. One of the most subtle but powerful things you can do is to neither overreact nor ignore. You don't need to argue to prove something's wrong. You just need to stop engaging. You don't need to condemn someone for their disrespect. You simply stop giving them the chance to repeat it. That quiet, clear withdrawal without bitterness is a language of strength. It says, "I saw what you did, and I choose not to overlook it, not to punish you, but to protect myself." Boundaries don't always need to be spoken. Sometimes they're how you don't respond to a message at midnight, how you don't laugh at a joke that crosses a line, how you say no to something that doesn't feel right without apologizing for it. Your silence, when placed well, can be a stronger statement than any declaration. And what matters most is that boundaries are not about controlling others, but about mastering yourself. About reminding yourself that you have the right not to be manipulated. Stoicism emphasizes acting from what is right, not from emotion. And holding boundaries is the right thing, because it guards you from trading your integrity for someone else's approval. You don't need to become hard to avoid being used. You just need to be clear enough that if someone crosses the line, they'll no longer have a place in your space. And that doesn't require long explanations. Once you live with clarity, others must choose respect you or remove themselves. Lesson 5. Silence can also be complicity. We often associate silence with calmness, maturity, or being well-mannered. But silence is not always a sign of virtue. In many situations, silence is not the stillness of a composed mind, but a sign of paralysis, a quiet form of compromise with what we should have rejected. And when silence becomes an excuse to avoid facing the truth, it no longer represents inner peace. It becomes a subtle form of complicity with what we know to be wrong. Stoicism does not encourage people to speak constantly, argue over everything, or resist anyone who makes them uncomfortable. But it also does not support silence so passive that it erases boundaries. Because when you remain silent in the face of disrespect, wrongdoing, or contempt, you don't just allow it to happen, you legitimize it. Every time you force a smile to move on, nod to keep the peace, or tell yourself, "not worth speaking up," you rewrite the story of who you are in others' minds. That you tolerate injustice, that you'll endure anything so long as it avoids conflict. One of Stoicism's core principles is that action must be guided by reason, not emotion. When your silence is not chosen because it's right, but because you fear misunderstanding, judgment, or disrupting harmony, it is no longer a rational decision. It is a surrender to fear. And the danger is that fear will grow stronger over time if you keep letting it lead your behavior. At some point, you will no longer know where your boundaries are because you have crossed them too many times in silence. That kind of silence doesn't ease tension. It only deepens your inner conflict. You start to feel disconnected from yourself, to doubt your integrity, and to live in a prolonged state of internal tension. The most dangerous thing isn't that others stop respecting you, it's that you slowly stop respecting yourself. And as your self-respect erodes, you begin to live defensively, shrinking, avoiding not to keep the peace, but to avoid the disappointment of once again staying silent when you shouldn't have. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "A man's worth is not measured by the praise of others, but by not harming himself in order to be praised." When you stay silent in the face of insult, you're injuring your own dignity just to preserve a fleeting sense of comfort. But the price of that comfort is high. You're left living with someone you no longer fully respect yourself. And no loneliness is deeper than living inside a body that no longer feels safe with its own choices. A Stoic understands there are times when silence helps avoid unnecessary conflict, but also times when silence is wrong, especially when it allows wrong to persist. Not reacting is not always noble. Sometimes it is paralysis disguised as morality. Sometimes it is fear wearing the mask of reason, and if we are not honest with ourselves, we'll keep calling resignation patience, endurance maturity, and submission wisdom, Courage in Stoic philosophy doesn't lie in raising your voice or being confrontational. It lies in calmly speaking what is right, in saying no to what is wrong without bitterness, in walking away from what's not aligned without apology. It is not rebellion, it is freedom. Freedom from others' expectations, freedom from the need to be liked, freedom from the habit of hurting yourself just to play the role of the agreeable one. A healthier world is not built by those who stay quiet to avoid trouble, but by those whose clarity makes even their silence weighty. Because the right silence can be a powerful refusal. A steady gaze can be a boundary no one dares to cross. And a lack of response can be the clearest answer to what no longer deserves your attention. Lesson 6. Treat yourself like an imperfect friend. There's a common and harmful belief that many carry through life, that only when they are good enough, skilled enough, perfect enough, do they deserve their own respect. They treat self-worth like a reward to be earned, instead of a foundation needed for emotional survival. But the truth is, if you wait until you're perfect to treat yourself kindly, you'll be waiting forever. And in the meantime, you've unknowingly become your own worst enemy. Through the words you use, the thoughts you feed, and the harsh judgments you make whenever you fall short. Stoicism does not promote indulgence or denial of mistakes. It doesn't invite you to sugarcoat failure with empty affirmations. On the contrary, Stoicism calls for an honest reckoning with yourself, especially in difficult times, when you fail, when you fall short, when you feel weak. Because in those moments, what you need is not an inner critic, but a friend, one who sees you not with the eyes of expectation, but of understanding. Self-respect is not a prize for achievement, it is a prerequisite for withstanding failure with strength. When you treat yourself like someone constantly needing correction, you turn the journey of growth into an endless punishment. And the irony is, the more you condemn yourself, the harder it becomes to grow. Not because you lack ability, but because you're burdened with the weight of always feeling wrong, incomplete, never enough. That weight turns every effort into a defense mechanism, every act of self-improvement into penance rather than progress. Stoic philosophy emphasizes that every person is a work in progress. No one is immune to flaws, not even the wise. The difference lies in how they respond to those flaws. A rational person doesn't torment themselves for their errors. They focus their mind on correcting and learning. They don't erase the past, they build on it to form a better present. And this is only possible when you stop treating yourself like a failure to be punished, and start seeing yourself as a loyal friend, imperfect but worth lifting. Imagine treating your closest loved one the way you often treat yourself, pointing out every mistake, dismissing their efforts, repeating how they're never good enough. Would that bond survive? Then why believe the bond with yourself can grow under such treatment? Self-love is not indulgence, it's a moral responsibility. Because when you know you deserve to be treated with respect, you will know how to treat others with that same respect. Epictetus once said, "You are a soul carrying a body, and that soul deserves more care than anything else." If you harm it with harsh thoughts, if you deny it compassion for wounds not yet healed, no one else can mend what you've broken. A life worth living isn't built on the idea that you must fix yourself to deserve love. It's sustained by kindness toward your own imperfection. This is not weakness, but the only way to turn weakness into strength, not by denying it, but by accepting it as part of the path. You don't need to be perfect to start treating yourself well. You just need to be honest and patient. Honest enough to admit your flaws. Patient enough not to use them as an excuse to punish yourself. When you begin practicing inner kindness, growth no longer feels heavy, it becomes a homecoming. A return to yourself wiser, more compassionate, and more grounded than before. Lesson 7. You are not defined by the outcome. The journey shapes you. In today's world, people are often driven by results. Achievements, reputation, metrics, and credentials have become the common standards for measuring a person's worth. But in Stoic philosophy, that reflects only a small fraction of who you are. What you achieve says far less about you than how you achieve it. And even when the outcome doesn't come, the journey you've walked remains yours. It cannot be taken away. You may not receive recognition from the world, but you can always preserve your self-respect if you've stayed true while walking through difficulty. A Stoic never evaluates themselves based on what lies beyond their control. They do not let success make them arrogant, nor failure make them ashamed. They focus on one thing only, whether their actions, decisions, and responses align with reason, virtue, and inner values. They understand that results are always shaped by external factors: luck, others' choices, random circumstances, and so, if they tie their worth to the outcome, they live like a boat with no anchor, drifting in the unpredictable winds of fortune. True worth is forged in the quiet moments where you choose what's right even when no one sees, in every temptation you resist without needing reward, in every small act you carry out, not for praise, but for principle. That is where dignity is formed, not on the stage of glory, but in the shadows of discipline and choice. And it is precisely those unrecognized moments that shape you in the deepest and most lasting ways. When you begin to cherish the journey, you no longer obsess over winning, proving, or being acknowledged. You realize that victory is not about surpassing others, but about not losing yourself along the way. And when the results fall short of expectations, you don't collapse because you know you lived honestly, acted rightly, and did not betray your ideals. That is a strength no one can take from you. I believe dignity is not something you discover through others' approval, but something you protect each day through how you live. In a world where noise is rewarded, where image matters more than depth, living quietly by personal values becomes both meaningful and challenging. Yet, it's in those challenges that your true character emerges. You don't need to win to be worthy, nor impress to earn respect. You only need to live clearly, act consistently, and refuse to betray what you believe in just to make life easier. Every time you choose weighty silence over impulsive reaction, every time you uphold your boundaries without explanation, every time you keep moving forward without applause, you're proving that inner strength doesn't come from others' eyes, but from the courage to remain loyal to yourself. If this video helped you see yourself more clearly, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss future content. Remember, you weren't born to please the world. You were born to live true to yourself quietly, steadfastly, and unshakably. See you in the next video.